Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're not just looking at a chess game. We're looking at the rise of a legend, Garry Kasparov. Kasparov was born in 1963 in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, then part of the Soviet Union. His family life shaped him deeply. His father, an Armenian engineer, died when Garry was only 7 years old. From then on, his mother, Clara, raised him alone. She wasn't a chess master herself, but she gave him something just as valuable: complete dedication. She believed in his talent from the very beginning and made incredible sacrifices to ensure he could train, travel, and study the game he loved. Kasparov's brilliance showed early. At just 12 years old, he was accepted into the famous Botvinnik Chess School, named after the great Soviet world champion Mikhail Botvinnik. This was not just a place for talented children, it was a factory for champions. There, Kasparov sharpened his skills, learning discipline, calculation, and the fighting spirit that would later define him. By his mid-teens, Garry was already standing out from the crowd. He wasn't just another young talent, he was fierce, intense, and unafraid to challenge established masters. His play was bold, creative, and electric. And in 1979, at only 16 years old, he had one of his early defining moments: his game against Elmar Magerramov. Magerramov was no easy opponent. A fellow Azerbaijani player, older and more experienced, Magerramov would later become the first grandmaster from their country. Known for his sharp style, he was the kind of player who could punish inaccuracy immediately. But Garry, even as a teenager, didn't flinch. With the black pieces, he attacked, created pressure, and eventually claimed victory. That game was more than just a point on the score sheet. It was proof that Garry Kasparov wasn't a promise. He was already becoming a force of nature. And today, we're going to relive that clash. Watch carefully, because in these moves, you'll see the early fire of the man who would go on to be called the greatest chess player of all time.
White starts the game with the pawn to d4, staking an early classical claim to the center and establishing a solid foundation for a strategic game. Black responds with the knight to f6, employing a hyper-modern approach by challenging White's center control indirectly from the flank, setting the stage for a flexible and dynamic counterattacking game. White reinforces their central dominance by moving the pawn to c4, expanding influence on the queen side and supporting a potential d5 advance. Black boldly enters the Benoni defense with the provocative pawn move to c5, a move that immediately unbalances the pawn structure and invites White to overextend. Accepting the challenge, White advances the pawn to d5, creating a powerful pawn wedge that grants a spatial advantage but also commits to a fixed structure, giving Black a clear target. Black immediately strikes at the base of this chain with the pawn to e6, challenging the d5 outpost and aiming to open lines for their pieces. White develops the knight to c3, its most natural square, supporting the central pawns. After Black captures on d5 and White recaptures with the c-pawn, Kasparov solidifies their structure with the pawn to d6, preparing a fianchetto. White continues development with the knight to f3, controlling key central squares. Black commits to their plan by moving the pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g7. White establishes a broad, imposing pawn center with the pawn to e4. Black fianchettos, and White does the same. Black castles kingside, tucking the king away to safety. White repeats the same move. Both sides complete their kingside development. White's center looks imposing, but is now the clear target. Kasparov increases the pressure by moving the bishop to g4, pinning the knight on f3 and threatening the e4 pawn. White develops the bishop to f4, eyeing the d6 weakness. Black centralizes a rook to the half-open e-file, piling pressure on e4. White connects the rooks and defends with the queen to c2. Black prepares queenside counterplay with the pawn to a6. White attempts to disrupt the pin with the pawn to h3, but this slightly weakens the kingside. Black executes a classic positional sacrifice, capturing the knight on f3 to inflict lasting structural damage by doubling White's f-pawns. White recaptures with the bishop, now burdened with a long-term weakness. Black centralizes the queen to c7, eyeing the weakened dark squares. White prevents Black's b5 advance with the pawn to a4, but this weakens the b4 square. Black plays a profound strategic pawn sacrifice with c4, opening a diagonal and creating a lasting weakness on c3. White gains space on the queenside with pawn to a5, but further commits to a rigid structure. Black develops the knight to d7. White attempts an ambitious rook lift to a4, but the rook appears awkward. Black centralizes a knight powerfully to e5, attacking the bishop. White decides to eliminate the knight with bishop to e5, but in doing so activates Black's rook in the center. Black recaptures, dominantly placing the rook on e5 to pressure the e4 pawn. White retreats the bishop to e2 to help defend. Black doubles rooks on the e-file, creating an unbearable pressure on the center. White captures the pawn on c4 to relieve the pressure, but this allows a decisive tactical sequence. Black calmly captures the a5 pawn with the queen. In desperation, White advances the f-pawn to dislodge the rook, further weakening the king's position. Kasparov retreats the rook to e7, maintaining pressure. White repositions the bishop to f3.
Black unleashes a thunderous pawn break with b5, striking at the root of White's position. White seeks counterplay by invading with the rook to c6. Black escalates the attack with pawn to b4, threatening the knight. And so the game reaches a critical juncture. White launches a desperate offensive by pushing the e-pawn to e5. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt Black's coordination. The move attacks Black's knight on f6 and seeks to create counterplay against Black's king. But it also leaves White's own structure vulnerable, especially with the a-pawn on a5 already lost and the queenside in disarray. Kasparov responds decisively by capturing the knight on c3 with the b-pawn. White continues the assault by capturing the knight on f6 with the pawn, opening the e-file, but this comes at a great cost. The pawn structure is shattered and the dark squares around White's king are critically weakened. Kasparov calmly recaptures with the bishop to f6. This bishop now eyes the vulnerable c3 pawn and the kingside. White tries to stabilize by recapturing on c3 with the b-pawn to c3, but this creates an isolated pawn on c3 that becomes an easy target. Black strikes immediately with rook to e1, a powerful rook invasion that seizes the first rank. This move not only threatens the white queen, but also sets up potential mating nets. White is forced to respond by moving the queen to d3 to defend the rook on f1. Black continues the assault with rook to f1, capturing White's rook. This simplifying exchange removes one of White's few active pieces. White recaptures with the queen to f1, but now the queen is passive and the king is dangerously exposed. Kasparov delivers the final blow with bishop to c3, capturing the weak pawn with the bishop. The bishop now attacks both the rook on a1 and the king's position. White tries to stay in the game by capturing the a-pawn with the queen to a6, but this leaves the king utterly defenseless. Black's bishop then moves to d4 with a check, a devastating move that forces the king into the corner. White has no choice but to move the king to h2, and Black concludes the game by moving the queen to e1, a crushing move that threatens mate and leaves White with no defense. And so, after queen to e1, White resigns, overwhelmed by Black's precise and relentless attack. This game is a perfect illustration of a fundamental truth in chess. You cannot launch a successful attack with a poorly defended king and a weak structure. White's desperation is understandable. The position was becoming difficult, But the pawn thrust in the center was a tactical miscalculation that played directly into Black's hands. Kasparov's response was a model of precision. Instead of panicking, they calmly dismantled White's position, first shattering the queenside, and then turning the exposed center into a highway for their pieces. The rook invasion was not just a threat, it was a statement. It demonstrated complete domination. Every single Black piece, from the bishop to the queen, coordinated in a final, crushing symphony of attack. The lesson here is that counterplay must be calculated with cold objectivity. One weakness can be defended, but two, on opposite sides of the board, are a death sentence. A powerful reminder that the attacker must always be wary of becoming the attacked. Subscribe for more deep dives into the most iconic games in chess history.